Hello, everyone. This week, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the ADA framework and organizational assessments. Clearly, I believe that organizational assessments feed the ADA framework. The ADA framework actually is developed over a lot of years, maybe 20 or so years, by the National Security Affairs faculty up at the War College. It is a derivative of a lot of academic work over the course of years, and to be fair, it is a very simplified framework. Our hope is not that you will necessarily find that this framework is the be all and end all of your work on structured decision making, but that it at least provides a starting point from which you can build, from which you can develop your own formal systems so that you will become better at this kind of work as you go forward. Another quick note is that the structured decision making that we talk about with ADA and organizational assessments and other things is very, very different than the kinds of decision making that you will conduct as a member of an operational unit. It isn't intended to replace standard operating procedures or learned tactics, but really is looking at a much more fluid and much less certain kind of environment where you need to understand what an organization is doing and why it is doing the things that it is. So let's take a look at ADA and organizational assessments just a little bit. This is a real quick summary of the overall objectives of what we're trying to do. But this is a way to try and use the skills that you've developed in critical thinking and disciplined assessment to try and understand how an organization is behaving, what it is that you might think could be done to improve that, how you will go about trying to implement the changes that you need to make, and perhaps most importantly, how you can be sure that the things you're doing are actually bearing fruit. So this graphic tries to show the various steps of the ADA framework. The oval off to the left really feeds the ADA framework. The thing that I'd like to draw your attention to, and you can obviously stop my narrative and read the slide as you go forward, is that this goes back and forward. There are sort of a cascading set of arrows going from assess to decide to implement and to assure. But if you look at the bottom of the slide, you can see that they also go backwards. The thing that you can't do here is you can't understand that in a real world, in a complex human environment, it takes a lot of effort to try and structure that. And upon many occasions, you'll find that you skip steps, and then you have to go backwards and forwards in a very, very human way to try and understand all of these. For our purposes, I'm going to try and follow this in a structured way. I will go from assess to decide to implement to assure. But you should understand that in a real world environment, you may need to start off with assess. I think that's always the first place to begin. And you might then begin to iterate backwards and forwards between implement and decide. And you probably are also, as you do the assessment, coming up with the various ways you'll assure whether or not you're being successful. Toss this slide in largely so that you can think of organizations in a much more holistic way than you might otherwise have done thus far, and to take a look at all of the various things that impact an organization, from stakeholders to the human capital to the technology and the material that you have, and on and on and on. All of these are important components of any organization. Normally what we think of is an org chart and people on that org chart. And my point in this slide is to suggest to you that it goes very, very much farther along than just that org chart. And your perspective of the organization absolutely matters. I've always loved these cartoons. The picture of the woman on the left has always been a favorite, and I can now train my eyes so that I can flip backwards and forwards. The thing that is amazing to me is that the feather remains the same always, no matter what my perspective is, but the person who is being portrayed changes in a dramatic way. The same thing is true of the bunny and the duck picture on the right. All of this really is a representation of the ancient Indian fable of the blind men trying to understand what an elephant looks like. My point, and the point that we try to get across here, is that you are actually an important component of all of this, and what you think actually matters and how you look at an organization. So these are from the readings that we have. There's 5 basic images of organization, and they range from a simple, perhaps assembly line kind of structure where people do the same thing day in and day out, and the people can be replaced. Just as a sidelight, it turned out that Henry Ford, no necessary lover of labor and the workers, figured out that he actually was better off if he paid workers a little bit more to hang around, because then he didn't have to spend so much time training them all the time. That being said, all of these are different ways you can look at organizations, and the Department of Defense and each of its subordinate organizations, really at different times and places, incorporates all 5 of these and many, many more besides. I think that there is a certain sense that says, this structured assessment is all well and good, but I don't do that. I'm a warfighter. And I would suggest to you that you think about the fact that you're not always a warfighter, although all that you do supports war fighting. But there is a huge element of the Department of Defense that would be much, much better off if it did sort of structured assessments an awful lot better, and a little bit more transparently than is sometimes the case. And all I have to do is, I think, to point out a number of really horrific acquisition failures. Since it's the Naval War College, I can pick on the problems that the Air Force has had in trying finally to replace or field a replacement tanker for the old KC-135s. Those airplanes are built on a Boeing 707 hull. Most of you are too old to remember the use of a 707 in commercial aviation. The DoD still uses them for refueling missions across the globe. And if I just mention that one alone to you, clearly I can come up, and you probably can come up with examples from the Marine Corps, from the Army, and certainly from the Navy, of other kinds of acquisitions where if someone had done a better job of looking at the problem up front, assessing what it was they were trying to do, and being more transparent about it, I think we could have done a lot better job than we've done. The idea of a structured assessment is that you will manage to minimize the various pitfalls that can occur. A lot of the pitfalls will come from the same kinds of pitfalls that occurred when we talked about structured thinking, and we talked about how we look at problems earlier and how we do critical analysis and critical thinking. And I would like you to think about those here as well. All of those pitfalls apply here, and we need all of these half dozen or so different kinds of elements to try and make sure that we avoid most of those pitfalls insofar as it's possible to do so. It's important to remember that you have different tools at your disposal, and you want to manage to use as many of them as you can. One of the things that we stress is SWOT. Hopefully you've run across this before. What I think is important to remember is that the strengths column tends to be internal, weaknesses will tend to be internal, opportunities and threats tend to be external, and it's the correlation in those various boxes that allow you to understand how the various strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats come together to try and present themselves as a way to understand how your organization is likely to perform and what might need to be done in order to improve it. There are gaps in what you think you would like to be able to do and where you think you can get. It's important to understand these as you go through any kind of structured analysis. And so I want to make sure that I at least gave you some idea as to how to understand gaps in what your organization is doing. And finally, I'd like to give you just a couple pages that are the takeaways from this week's stuff. The one thing that I want to stress, especially on these 2 pages, is the idea of not skipping on assessment. My experience over more years than I care to count says that every unit of time I spent in assessment tended to save me 5 or 6 comparable multiple units. So if I spent an extra week in assessment in a complex problem, then I was likely to save many months of implementation time, simply because I understood what it was I was trying to implement a little bit better. The clear enemy of this is the ready, fire, aim kind of paradigm, and you really need to avoid that. As you get into complex problems, you may feel like you're making progress, but you're almost certainly likely to have to go back and start over and over again. And then I'll conclude with just these things. And again, plead with you to try and understand what the assessment or what the logical assessment will be of the problems that you're going to be facing. The remainder of these slides are back up, and I will leave them for you to peruse as you think appropriate.